I'm Frank from 5A Ramen, and this is the Yamanote line ramen series. We're in Yurakucho, home to glass towers, smoky alleyways, and two fantastic bowls of ramen that we're going to be featuring. Let's go.
We are continuing our clockwise journey around the Yamanote line. 30 stations, 30 ramen stops, and today we're at stop number 2, Yurakucho Station. In this series, I'm visiting my favorite ramen shops near every Yamanote line station. Sometimes it's a personal favorite, sometimes it's a local gem, and sometimes it's a spot I've never been to before. If you missed the first episode, we kick things off at Tokyo Station, the massive hub at the center of the city. There, I featured a shop called Kaneda and walked through the area's ramen scene, Tokyo Ramen Street, and a whole lot of big-name bowls. Now, Yurakucho. It sits right next to Tokyo Station, but has a very different feel. It's more compact, but still pretty commercial, with a surprising number of shopping malls and high-end boutiques nearby. But what really sets Yurakucho apart is the contrast. Right next to the glassy, modern Tokyo International Forum, you've got the gritty, old-school energy of Gadoshita, bars, izakayas, and local spots tucked under the train tracks. It's that kind of area. A little shiny, a little gritty, and very Tokyo. For today's ramen stop, I'm heading to a shop that's been around since 1967. But before I tell you more, I'll walk you through how I chose it. And after that, I'll talk a little bit more about Yurakucho itself and what kind of ramen scene this area really has. Let's get into stop number 2 on this ramen-fueled ride around the Yamanote line.
I'm keeping it as Yurakucho as possible by filming directly under the train tracks here, but the issue, of course, is that it's very noisy. This is an older station too. I definitely feel like on some parts of the track they can grease the wheels a little bit more. Despite the challenges with finding that window to record, this is what makes, to me, Yurakucho really special. A lot of these under-the-track eateries just exude all this personality because of that. And the place that we're going to be featuring today is exactly one of those. It's under the tracks. Before we get inside this ramen shop, which is called Tani Ramen, by the way, I want to talk a little bit about a different bowl here in Yurakucho because it's a nice contrast to Tani. The ramen restaurant is called Hyottoko, and they are located inside an old school shopping mall. And it's a tiny, tiny place with only a few seats. Now, while Hyottoko is in a shopping mall, completely different experience compared to what you get at Tokyo Station, where it's very commercialized. Food experiences are so much more unique, I'd say. And that's what we're going to be really showcasing today with our two ramen shops. So first, a little bit about Hyottoko. They serve Shio ramen, and I'm a huge fan of Shio ramen. To me, it's just ramen in its purest form. Shio being a super light seasoning, just being salt. Maybe they'll be fancy using some type of sea salt or rock salt, but let's just say salt in itself. It's such a pure form of seasoning. And even though Shio ramen can tend to be very simple in appearance, execution, there is something to be said about how it's also very complex at the same time. I know it's kind of like a dichotomy, but Shio ramen is not easy to do well because there's no hiding, because that salt seasoning is so light. If there are any wrongdoings, I'm making it sound like it's a crime if you don't make ramen properly. If there's mistakes in the broth, for example, it's right there front and center for you to notice if you have a light Shio seasoning. And that is, I think, what makes Shio ramen so beautiful. Anyways, enough rambling about Shio. Let's talk about the Shio ramen at Hyottoko. They have a beautiful soup that is chicken, pork, and fish, but also punctuated with yuzu, or Japanese citrus. And there are not too many places in Tokyo that do yuzu Shio ramen, period. Not even well, but Hyottoko is up there. There is another place called Iruka in Roppongi that does like a fancier, more modern bowl. Hyottoko a little bit more old school, even though I think their approach is still very complex. Hyottoko serves one of the best yuzu Shio ramen bowls in Tokyo, if not the best, and I highly recommend it for the ramen and for the experience. That said, enough about Hyottoko. Let's dive into Tani Ramen. They've been around since 1967, right here under the tracks. Let's go. I found a nice little roadside cafe right outside the Tokyo International Forum. This is an architectural marvel, I think, in the city. Very sleek and modern, and of course, it hosts a lot of great events. And it's really the symbol, in a way, of Yurakucho. Of course, we contrast that with its underbelly, all of the the tracks, ramen restaurants, drinking places. And it's that fun contrast, I think, that really represents Tokyo. Not to sound poetic or anything, but that's what Yurakucho and Tokyo as a whole is really all about. And that could be said, I think, about cities around the world, those contrasts. Not every city is the same everywhere you go. Neighborhoods are gonna be very different. But I think what's different about Tokyo is that you turn a corner and it's completely different. It's like you're transported into another city in some ways. And Yurakucho can feel like that, I think, depending on where you are, depending on where you turn that corner. Tani Ramen, the ramen restaurant I visited. This was wonderful in that it brought me back to childhood. You're gonna get a sense of how old I am when I start talking about the 80s and 90s. So let's just say 90s, when I was old enough to go to a ramen restaurant without sitting in a high chair. Tani Ramen was a lot of what I experienced as a kid. This is when it was no frills, simple is best ramen. In the case of Tani Ramen, it's a soy sauce, pretty simple soy sauce, holding up a very light pork bone soup. This mirrors a lot of classic Tokyo bowls where they're not really pushing forward some revolutionary ramen. This is when ramen was simpler. It comes from a simpler time. And ramen is pretty young. We look at the evolution of ramen, all these crazy styles, the variety, the presentation, fancy ingredients that you get nowadays, that was not there even in the 90s. This place was quite literally frozen in time, 1967 to be exact. What I really liked though, even though the soup was super simple and it brought me back to childhood in a lot of ways, I had wonderful noodles created by Maruyama Seimen, great noodle manufacturer, and those noodles had great bite to them. The chashu was a little bit more old school, a little bit tougher, but still delicious, and I decided to get it with the wontons. Those wontons were pretty much mostly wrapper and garlic, but they were great. They filled up the bowl, a lot of fluffiness in the bowl as a result of that. I would say wrapper and garlic to meat ratio is something like 5-to-1. I'm exaggerating, of course. Outside of that, the only other toppings were memma, very old school bamboo shoots, and also spring onions. Again, classic bowl, nothing that's reinventing the wheel, but it just brought me back to childhood. And just talking to the ramen shop owner, the way he speaks and interacted with me, it was definitely like it would have been back in the day. Now to compare Tani Ramen to Hyottoko, two very different bowls. I think Hyottoko was a bit more modern, even though they're also quite old school in some ways with how the ramen shop feels, but also in their approach. They provide, I think, a bit more complexity with their soup, and it's a very different bowl in that it's Yuzu powered with Shio. Very bright, whereas Tani Ramen was more shoyu, of course. It's a shoyu ramen and more tangy, a little bit sweet, salty as a result of that. But it wasn't a bold soy sauce, pretty straightforward. So I think it depends on what you're after. I personally like Hyottoko Shio ramen. So as a ramen, I think I like Hyottoko a lot, and they've got a great experience. But if you look at just the experience itself, going under the tracks, I think for me, interacting with the ramen shop owner, feeling like I've been transported to the 80s or 90s, maybe even the 60s, that was so much fun for me. And you don't get too many shops in Tokyo like that nowadays. They're harder to come by, so it's great that that has continued with Tani Ramen to today. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about Yurakucho in the neighborhood. I already did a lot of that, but outside of the forum, I think the biggest highlight again is everything underneath the train tracks. And even though in modern times there has been more development, you've got some fancier under the tracks areas. Even today, I went to Dottore, which is a local big coffee chain. Still the fact that these places, even if they are chains, have to work with this low ceiling, long kind of space, there's still character, even if they're chains. But that said, you still have a lot of hole in the wall mom and pop's places, including Tani, that are very much worth visiting. And as I'm starting this part, I don't know if you can hear it behind me, there's a lot of organ music. There's a piano there playing by itself. I don't know if this will be the best outro. It's kind of got a little bit of Phantom of the Opera kind of vibe. Anyways, Yurakucho is a must visit and not a place that a lot of tourists are going to go to unless you got an event at the International Forum. That said, check out the International Forum if you're a fan of architecture, but definitely once the sun goes down, check out the little eateries underneath the track. You don't necessarily need to eat there, but grab some photos. Tiny little places, a lot of them just like Tani Ramen, reminding us of what Tokyo was like back in the day. I hope you enjoyed this episode 2 in the Yamanote line ramen series. And next up, we're going to be visiting Shimbashi. In Shimbashi, you've also got a ton of places that are also under the tracks, but even more so, let's say, in a neon lit salaryman way. And Shimbashi, compared to Yurakucho and Tokyo Station, has an insane amount of ramen shops. It might be equal to Tokyo Station in terms of big name ramen shops, but the difference is that in Shimbashi, we've got hole-in-the-wall places. Anyways, stay tuned for the next episode. Hope you enjoyed this episode again. And if you did, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Frank from 5am Ramen signing out from Yurakucho.